Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we're diving into a really incredible historical document, the personal diary of the 18th century missionary David Brainerd. So here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with who he was, then get into the constant sickness he dealt with, his deep spiritual struggles, his wild prayer life, his absolute focus on his mission, and finally, the first little bits of success he saw. This diary is just a raw, unfiltered look at a life completely given over to God. Let's start with his arrival in the American wilderness. All right, so let's set the scene. The year is 1744. David Brainerd is a young guy, he's just been ordained, and he's been sent out as a missionary into the wilderness. We're talking about the area near the forks of the Delaware River. His job? To bring the gospel to the Delaware Indians. You know, this one quote really tells you everything you need to know about his mindset. From day one, Brainerd was completely convinced that if anything good was going to happen, it wasn't going to be because of him. It had to be God changing people's hearts. This idea of total dependence, you see it on almost every single page of his diary. And look, this idea of depending on God wasn't just a nice theological point for him. It was forged in the fire of nonstop physical pain. I mean, his diary is basically a record of him being sick all the time. This wasn't just a side note in his story. It was a huge part of his everyday existence. The list of things wrong with him is just mind-boggling. He talks about headaches so bad he felt like he was losing his sanity. He describes being so weak he couldn't walk or even sit or lie down without being agitated. He literally says he felt like his body was just completely spent. But here's the thing that's so stunning. His reaction to all this pain. He gets horribly sick, but instead of getting angry, he sees God's goodness in it. Why? Because the timing meant he got sick where friends could look after him, not out alone in the woods. He always seemed to find God's mercy right in the middle of his troubles. At the same time he's dealing with all this physical pain, he's got an equally intense spiritual battle going on. Brainerd went through these really dark periods of spiritual dejection, where he was just crushed by a sense of his own sinfulness. And we're not talking about just having a bad day. This quote shows you how low he got. He saw himself as the vilest, meanest creature upon earth. To him, this was a real conviction of how unworthy he was before a holy God. It was so strong that he couldn't even imagine being able to stand in heaven. But his diary shows the flip side too. You see this wild back and forth. One day he's sunk down under a load of sin and guilt, and then a few days later, his faith and hope in God were much raised. These huge swings between spiritual darkness and light are just a constant rhythm in his life. So how in the world did he deal with all this? The physical suffering, the spiritual darkness? His diary gives us one main answer. He prayed. A lot. And with incredible intensity. His pain didn't push him to give up. It pushed him to God. This entry is one of the most striking things he ever wrote. For Brainerd, prayer wasn't a calm, quiet little activity. It was a physical wrestling match with God. He describes pleading so hard that when he was done, he was physically exhausted, joints loose, pouring sweat, feeling like his body was about to fall apart. Okay, so what was he praying for so intensely? Well, it was hardly ever for himself to feel better physically. He was praying for the conversion of the Indians, for his own holiness, for Christ's kingdom to grow, and for his friends and other ministers. His focus was almost always on things outside of himself. And this intense prayer life, it's what kept him going in his work. I mean, despite being so sick and struggling spiritually, he stayed laser-focused on his calling to the Indians. This trip to the Susquehannah River is the perfect example of what his life was like. He goes into what he calls a hideous and howling wilderness. His horse breaks its leg, so he has to put it down and walk the rest of the way. He's sleeping outside in the frost, with wolves howling around him. For Brainerd, this kind of stuff was just part of the job description. Yeah, he reached a point where he just accepted that suffering was going to be part of his life. He basically says, I expect trouble in this world, and that looking forward to his final home was a huge comfort to him when things were at their worst. So after months and months of this brutal, grinding work, with basically zero results to show for it, something finally starts to happen. Right, and the setting for this breakthrough is actually a moment of total discouragement. He sees the Indians taking part in a ceremony that he, from his 18th century Christian viewpoint, calls idolatrous feasts and devil worship. He's just gutted. He feels like everything he's done has been a complete waste. But then, just a few days later, he's preaching again, and he says that God helped him speak with this real warmth, and for the first time, people responded. The adults were moved. They had tears running down their faces. Even an old man, who he figures was about 100 years old, started weeping. And this moment was a massive turning point for him personally. Before, he was in a great degree of despair. After, his diary is suddenly full of praise and prayer, and this real concern that the work God seemed to have started would keep going. The change is just night and day. So when you step back and look at his diary as a whole, you see this really clear pattern. His life was built on a bedrock of suffering, both in his body and in his soul. His go-to response was always this persistent, intense prayer. And that prayer is what fueled his focus on the mission and his total dependence on God to bring any results. And this really gets us to the final thought here. Brainerd's story, a life full of sickness, depression, and what looked like failure most of the time, is so different from how we usually think about success. It leaves us with a big question to chew on. How does his life of suffering and dependence challenge our modern ideas of what a successful life or ministry is supposed to look like today?